Architectures of Spiritual Consciousness, Introduction. The 9 world-forming modes of spiritual consciousness. Spiritual traditions are usually described through doctrines, scriptures, rituals, institutions, and historical lineages. Yet beneath these visible forms, there is often something closer to lived experience, a recurring way in which a person approaches what they regard as ultimate. One person meets the sacred chiefly through love and relationship, another through discipline and purification, another through exact ritual form, compassionate action, philosophical inquiry, visionary receptivity, the stripping away of every secondary identification, or the effort to gather many levels of experience into a coherent whole. These modes are not identical with religions or schools. They may appear across very different traditions, and several may coexist within one person. Yet one often becomes predominant. It gives spiritual life its center of gravity and becomes the language through which the other faculties are understood. Sometimes it is simply a matter of temperament. Sometimes it is the form of practice that first opened something real. Sometimes it is the world that carried a person through suffering when little else could. This series will consider 9 such modes: the devotional-relational mind, reality encountered through love, intimacy, surrender, remembrance, and relationship with the beloved; the ascetic-purificatory mind, reality approached through restraint, simplification, discipline, and the purification of conduct, appetite, and intention; the ritual-sacramental mind, reality made present through sacred form, sequence, gesture, sound, substance, and inherited correspondence; the compassionate-liberative mind, reality encountered through responsiveness to suffering and through commitment to the liberation, healing, or welfare of others; the analytical-dialectical mind, reality approached through definition, valid knowledge, logical distinction, inference, objection, and argument; the subtractive-axial mind, reality approached by stripping away identification and conceptual proliferation, and by returning toward the source, center, emptiness, or non-objectifiable axis of experience; the integrative-architectural mind, reality disclosed through differentiation, comparison, synthesis, and the construction of a coherent whole in which many levels of experience and knowledge can find their place; the visionary-receptive mind, reality received through images, dreams, revelation, altered states, symbolic encounters, currents, or forms of knowing that seem to exceed deliberate thought; the transgressive-transformative mind, reality approached by crossing, reversing, or revaluing boundaries between pure and impure, sacred and profane, body and spirit, desire and renunciation, so that what spiritual life ordinarily excludes may become material for transformation. This list is neither a hierarchy nor a claim to final completeness. The modes are not rigid psychological types, and actual spiritual personalities are rarely pure examples of only one. The purpose of distinguishing the modes is not to divide living people into sealed compartments. It is to make visible the different faculties through which spiritual worlds are built, and to understand why one path may feel like home to one person while remaining almost unintelligible to another. Each mode can become sufficiently comprehensive to organize almost the whole of life. It can determine what counts as knowledge, where authority is located, how suffering is interpreted, what practice should accomplish, and what spiritual maturity is expected to look like. This capacity gives each mode its dignity and transformative force. It also creates its characteristic danger. A mode that reveals one dimension of reality with extraordinary depth may gradually begin to treat that dimension as the whole. What began as a path of access can become a complete and self-confirming universe. The following reflections will therefore ask 2 questions of each mode. What truth does it disclose that the other modes may overlook? And what distortion appears when its particular truth is made absolute? The aim is not to stand above these modes and choose a final winner. It is to understand how each can illuminate a world, change a human life, and still remain one way in which consciousness approaches what exceeds it. What is a mode of spiritual consciousness? The word mode is used here with some caution. It does not refer to a fixed personality type, a religious denomination, or a developmental stage through which everyone must pass, nor is it meant to reduce a living person to one permanent category. People are always more complicated than the map. A mode of spiritual consciousness is a recurrent way in which a person approaches what they regard as ultimate. It shapes what they notice, what they trust, how they practice, where they locate authority, and what they imagine transformation to be. These are not merely different techniques applied by an otherwise unchanged mind. Over years, a mode can reorganize the whole field of experience. It influences what feels profound or superficial, what counts as evidence, what kind of person appears spiritually mature, and which dangers are recognized or remain almost invisible. One direct qualification is necessary. The nine modes are not perfectly symmetrical categories. Some are centered more strongly in feeling, some in conduct, some in attention, some in knowledge, and some in the transformation of boundaries. Living spiritual life does not arrange itself into a mathematically clean table. They are placed together for a functional reason. Each can become a predominant organizing center of spiritual life. Each can establish its own form of authority, gather the other faculties around itself, and create a world sufficiently complete for a person to live inside it. The map is therefore not a formal classification of identical psychological units. It is an attempt to name 9 recurring ways in which spiritual life acquires coherence, force, and direction. The attempt to distinguish recurring forms of religious consciousness is not new. William James examined the inner varieties of religious experience. Max Weber developed ideal types of orientations, such as asceticism and mysticism. Ninny and Smart described the dimensions through which religions become complete worlds. Weber's ideal type is especially useful here. Not a perfect or pure specimen, but an analytical construction that clarifies a recurrent tendency otherwise obscured by mixture. The modes should be understood in this spirit. They are instruments of perception, not boxes into which historical figures must be forced. Yet the present investigation differs from conventional comparative religion in its central emphasis. It is not primarily asking which experiences occur in religion, which social conduct a doctrine produces, or which dimensions are present within a tradition. It asks what faculty of consciousness becomes predominant, and what kind of complete spiritual world does that faculty construct. The emphasis falls upon the internal organizing power of the mode. What does it treat as the most trustworthy access to truth? What central operation does it perform? How does it reinterpret the remaining dimensions of life through its own language? What kind of human being can mature through it? And what characteristic distortion appears when its partial truth begins to present itself as the whole? This last question is essential. The distortions examined in the series are not simply accidental corruptions introduced from outside. They often arise from the same faculty that gives a mode its greatness. The same power often creates both the mature possibility and the characteristic temptation. This is why criticism from outside is not enough. One has to understand what is precious in the mode before its distortion can be seen clearly. A mode, therefore, cannot be understood only through its doctrines. It must also be examined through the kind of attention it cultivates, the authority it establishes, the experiences it privileges, and the form of ego most capable of appropriating it. The investigation is psychological, but it does not assume that spiritual life is only psychological. A devotional encounter may be more than projection. A vision may confront the person with something that feels genuinely autonomous. A contemplative opening may disclose more than a technique of mental regulation. At the same time, the interpretation supplied by a tradition cannot simply be treated as proven. The experience itself and the doctrine used to explain it must remain distinguishable. The map is provisional, a working aid rather than a final anatomy of spiritual life. Its claim is limited but substantial. Beneath the visible boundaries of religions, recurring modes of consciousness can be observed. Each reveals something with unusual force, can organize a nearly complete universe, and develops characteristic blind spots when it becomes sovereign. The map also has a standpoint. This analysis is itself chiefly integrative and architectural. It compares structures, distinguishes levels, and looks for a larger pattern capable of holding them together. That standpoint should not be concealed. It will notice certain relations and dangers more readily than a purely devotional, ritual, visionary, or subtractive consciousness would. The task is not to pretend to a view from nowhere, but to remain conscious of the faculty through which the map is being drawn. Why traditions are an inadequate primary classification. Religious traditions are usually treated as the most obvious units of spiritual comparison. We speak of Christianity, Buddhism, Vaishnavism, Saivism, Sufism, Tantra, Advaita Vedanta, or Zen as though each represented a relatively unified mode of consciousness. Historically and institutionally, this is understandable. Traditions possess scriptures, doctrines, rituals, lineages, sacred places, authoritative figures, and recognizable communities. They provide the visible containers through which spiritual life is transmitted. Yet, anyone who has lived inside a tradition knows that the external container does not tell us how it is actually inhabited. Two people may belong to the same lineage, worship the same deity, repeat the same mantra, and accept the same theology while living in substantially different spiritual worlds. One may inhabit the tradition through love, remembrance, and service to the beloved, another through purity, mantra, timing, and exact procedure, another through doctrine and argument, another through dreams, altered states, and revelation, another through ethical action and responsibility toward others. The official identity remains the same. The operative consciousness is different. The same activity may therefore carry very different inner meanings. Chanting may be an outpouring of love, a disciplined obligation, a ritual whose exact pronunciation must be preserved, a means of entering an altered state, or an instrument of public conversion. The external act alone does not reveal the governing mode. Even the same spiritual concept can serve different psychic functions. Surrender may mean tenderness toward the beloved, obedience to a teacher, relinquishment of personal agency, acceptance of fate, dissolution of the ego, or submission to institutional authority. The word remains unchanged, while the consciousness organized around it may be radically different. The inverse is also true. People belonging to different religions may resemble one another deeply because the same mode governs them. A Vaisnava poet, a Christian mystic, and a Sufi lover of God may differ in theology while sharing the grammar of lover and beloved. A Buddhist logician, a Nyaya scholar, and a Christian scholastic may defend incompatible conclusions while sharing trust in definition and argument. Ritual specialists from distant traditions may share the intuition that sacred order must be enacted through bodily and material form. The mode can therefore cross doctrinal boundaries, while the same doctrine can be inhabited through several modes. A concise distinction may be useful. Tradition provides the vocabulary, symbols, practices, and inherited world. The dominant mode determines how that world is experienced, organized, and made spiritually authoritative. This does not make tradition superficial. A mode never appears in a cultural vacuum. Its expression is shaped by the theology, ethics, ritual possibilities, and institutions available to it. Bhakti in Gaudiya Vaishnavism is not identical with Christian bridal mysticism or Sufi longing, just as visionary consciousness in a Shakta environment will not interpret experience as a Pentecostal Christian or an indigenous shaman would. Tradition supplies names, images, expectations, and limits to what appears. The distinction is therefore not between an authentic inner mode and a merely external tradition. The two continually shape one another. A tradition gives form to a mode. A mode selects, intensifies, and rearranges elements within a tradition. The devotional personality will notice its hymns, saints, stories of grace, and language of intimacy. The ritual personality will gravitate toward manuals, initiations, calendars, purity rules, and ceremonial detail. The analytical personality will find commentaries, doctrinal disputes, and systems of interpretation. The visionary personality will seek accounts of miracles, revelation, subtle worlds, and divine intervention. Each may sincerely believe that they are inhabiting the tradition as a whole, while in practice giving disproportionate life to the elements most congenial to their own structure. This also explains why conflicts within a tradition are often deeper than disagreements over doctrine. Two members may officially accept the same theology, but distrust one another because their governing modes differ. The ritualist may experience the spontaneous devotee as careless, the devotee may experience the ritualist as dry, the analyst may regard both as imprecise, the visionary may regard the analyst as closed to living reality. These conflicts arise from different intuitions about what spirituality fundamentally is. Each mode has its own standard of seriousness: love, clarity, correct transmission, living encounter, transformed conduct, or investigation of the very self making the judgment. The failure to recognize these differences produces shallow judgments. One mode evaluates another exclusively through standards that belong to itself. The devotee is dismissed as emotional, the ritualist as mechanical, the philosopher as merely intellectual, the contemplative as passive, the visionary as unstable, the activist as externally oriented. Sometimes these criticisms are accurate. Every mode has immature expressions, but a judgment becomes shallow when it cannot recognize the kind of transformation the other mode is actually attempting. The purpose of this taxonomy is therefore not to replace traditions with psychological categories. It introduces a second axis of understanding. The first asks, which tradition, doctrine, lineage, or community does this person inhabit? The second asks, which faculty of consciousness organizes that tradition from within? Only both questions together give a sufficiently precise picture. This distinction also makes comparison across traditions more honest. Instead of asking only which religion is more profound, one can ask which modes each tradition cultivates especially well, which it suppresses, and which distortions its structures make more likely. Some traditions cultivate particular modes with exceptional depth while neglecting the faculties that could correct them: devotion without discrimination, ritual precision without flexibility, logical exactness without emotional transformation, vision without integration, or contemplation without psychological preparation. No tradition is reducible to such tendencies, but none is entirely free from them. The visible religion may provide the score. The mode is the musical language through which the score is interpreted, and two people may perform the same score so differently that inwardly they are no longer inhabiting the same world. How a spiritual mode becomes a complete world. A spiritual mode often begins quietly, as one faculty among others. It may begin as love, discrimination, ritual attention, moral responsibility, philosophical inquiry, visionary receptivity, or the direct investigation of consciousness. At first, it addresses only one part of spiritual life. Over time, however, the mode may become sufficiently comprehensive to organize almost everything. It begins to interpret suffering. It determines what counts as evidence. It establishes a model of maturity. It assigns authority. It explains failure. It identifies danger. It defines the purpose of practice. At that point, the mode is no longer merely one instrument among others. It has become a world. Mature bhakti can gather the whole of life into relationship with the beloved. Joy becomes grace. Pain becomes separation or purification. Memory becomes remembrance. Action becomes service. And death becomes reunion. The distinction between practice and ordinary life weakens because every experience can be interpreted through relationship. The subtractive-axial mode creates a different but equally complete world. Suffering, vision, doubt, ethical conflict, and aspiration are turned back toward the axis on which they appear to depend. In Ramana's language, the question may be, who is the one claiming this experience? In Zen or Buddhist analysis, the movement may expose the inability to find any independent center at all. The strength of the mode lies in this economy. Rather than constructing a separate answer for every difficulty, it questions the identifications and conceptual structures through which the difficulty is being claimed. The ritual-sacramental mode reorganizes time, space, body, sound, substance, and sequence. Correct form is no longer decoration around spiritual experience. It becomes the means by which sacred reality is made present, shared, and preserved. The analytical-dialectical mind constructs a universe through valid determination. Claims are defined, sources of knowledge established, implications followed, and contradictions exposed. The visionary-receptive mind develops completeness through another grammar. Dreams become messages, coincidences, signs, bodily currents, indications of invisible activity, and rupture or illness possible initiation. The boundary between inner and outer, psychological and spiritual, personal and transpersonal becomes permeable. The integrative-architectural mind seeks a place for every level. It compares systems, distinguishes functions, and gathers apparently opposed truths into a wider structure. The transgressive-transformative mind performs another movement. It turns toward what spiritual respectability excludes: body, desire, impurity, terror, social shame, or forbidden power, and asks whether these rejected dimensions can be transformed rather than merely suppressed. Kaula and some Vajrayana currents ritualize this movement. Holy Fool and Kalandari traditions express a different form of sacred marginality. These currents should not be collapsed into one doctrine, but they share a willingness to make convention itself part of the spiritual question. What distinguishes these worlds is not merely their content, it is the operation through which content is transformed into meaning. The same event may enter several spiritual worlds and become almost unrecognizable from one to another. A period of suffering may be interpreted by the devotee as separation from the beloved, by the ascetic as an opportunity for purification. by the ritualist as a disturbance requiring restoration of order, by the compassionate practitioner as a deepening of solidarity with suffering beings, by the subtractive practitioner as an occasion to examine the one who claims the suffering, or the absence of any fixed claimant, by the visionary as an initiation, by the architectural mind as material requiring differentiation and integration, and by the transgressive mind as an encounter with what ordinary spiritual identity had tried to exclude. The event remains one. The world in which it appears changes. This is one reason spiritual disagreement is often so difficult to resolve. People may appear to dispute interpretations while actually inhabiting different structures of meaning. Each interpretation follows naturally from the mode that generated it. A complete spiritual world offers tremendous psychological and existential power. This is not merely a theoretical advantage. For many people, such a world becomes a way to endure. It reduces fragmentation. It gathers experiences that might otherwise appear unrelated. It gives suffering a place. It establishes direction. It tells the practitioner what to trust and what to distrust. It allows practices, texts, teachers, emotions, and metaphysical ideas to reinforce one another. A path rarely transforms a life through one isolated proposition. It becomes transformative when enough dimensions of life are drawn into a shared pattern. This is why the completeness of a mode should not be treated only as a danger. A person sustained for decades by devotion, contemplation, ritual, service, or ethical discipline is not merely trapped inside a framework. The framework may have given coherence where none existed, preserved sanity during crisis, disciplined destructive impulses, created community, given grief a language, or opened dimensions of experience that would otherwise have remained inaccessible. Criticism that forgets this will remain emotionally and spiritually shallow. A world can be both constructed and real in its effects. It may disclose genuine truths precisely because it trains attention consistently in one direction. The devotional world notices subtleties of relationship that a purely analytical mind may overlook. The ritual-sacramental world perceives the formative power of repetition, space, gesture, and material form. The analytical world notices contradictions that emotional sincerity cannot resolve. The visionary-receptive world encounters autonomous and symbolic dimensions of experience that ordinary rational consciousness may exclude. The subtractive-axial world detects the instability of the very subject claiming all these experiences. A mode becomes powerful by developing sensitivity to what other modes may barely notice. Its danger arises from the same specialization. The more successfully a mode interprets experience, the more difficult it becomes to recognize where its interpretation has become automatic. The devotional world may interpret every silence of the beloved as hidden grace. The fierce grace framework may interpret every wound as deliberate instruction. The subtractive-axial world may treat every request for psychological understanding as avoidance of the source. The ritual-sacramental world may interpret failure as insufficient precision, impurity, or breach of transmission. The visionary-receptive world may treat every coincidence as communication. The analytical-dialectical world may assume that what cannot be established in its categories is confused or meaningless. The integrative-architectural world may place every rival position within its own larger synthesis, and thereby avoid being fundamentally challenged by it. The ascetic-purificatory world may interpret every desire as impurity. The compassionate-liberative world may treat limits or withdrawal as selfishness. The transgressive-transformative world may begin to regard every boundary as repression and every shock as liberation. This is the beginning of epistemic closure. The framework no longer merely illuminates experience. It determines in advance what experience is permitted to mean. Contradiction can even strengthen the system. An answered prayer confirms grace. An unanswered one becomes a lesson in surrender. A successful ritual confirms its efficacy. Failure is attributed to impurity, imperfect procedure, or an invisible fruit. Stillness confirms the subtractive path. Frustration becomes resistance by the ego. Accurate visions confirm revelation. Inaccurate ones become symbolic or distorted. A transgressive act that liberates confirms the method. One that harms is explained as the student's lack of readiness or inability to understand. A sufficiently flexible world can absorb evidence both for and against itself. This does not prove the world false. Many complex truths require subtle interpretation, but it creates a serious problem. The mode may become increasingly difficult to correct. The system can become self-sealing. The same language that once opened reality now protects the framework from reality. A useful distinction can therefore be made between world-forming and world-closing. A world-forming mode gives enough coherence for experience to become meaningful, but remains capable of learning from what exceeds it. A world-closing mode translates every challenge back into its own vocabulary before the challenge can be fully heard. The first creates orientation, the second creates enclosure. The transition between them is rarely obvious. It may occur precisely because the mode has produced genuine insight. A weak system is easy to leave. A powerful one has already demonstrated its truth in many areas of life. The practitioner may therefore reason, this path transformed me. This teacher revealed something indispensable. This practice carried me through suffering. This doctrine explains experiences that other systems cannot explain. Therefore, it must be the final and complete structure. The conclusion is understandable, but it does not follow. A mode may be profound without being exhaustive. It may be uniquely effective for a particular operation without becoming universally sufficient. It may contain a world without containing reality as such. The analogy with music is useful here. A great musical language can create an entire universe in which tension, silence, development, and resolution acquire distinctive coherence. Yet the completeness of a fugue, a raga, or a blues performance does not abolish other musical languages. Spiritual modes operate similarly. Their highest expressions do not merely offer opinions, they compose experience into worlds. The central question is therefore not whether these worlds are real or unreal in some simple sense. It is, what do they make visible? What do they transform? What can they no longer see once their own grammar becomes absolute? A mode reaches maturity not when it ceases to form a world, but when the world it forms remains transparent to what exceeds it. It can speak in its own language without requiring all other truths to be translated into that language. It can offer coherence without claiming possession of the whole. It can remain a world without becoming a prison. Mixture, predominance, and changing configurations. The distinction among spiritual modes is useful only if it does not become another rigid classification. People are not diagrams. Actual personalities are rarely pure examples of one mode. A person may be devotional, ritualistic, visionary, analytical, ascetic, and compassionate at different moments, or even at the same time. What usually matters is not exclusivity, but predominance. One mode tends to provide the central grammar through which the others are expressed. A spiritual personality may be compared to a composer who works in several forms while remaining governed by a recognizable musical language. The dominant mode does not determine every passage, but it shapes how the whole composition breathes. A predominantly devotional person may possess great philosophical intelligence, but that intelligence will often serve relationship with the beloved. Theology becomes a clarification of love. Metaphysics becomes a language for divine intimacy. Ethical discipline becomes an offering. A predominantly ritualistic person may also be devotional, but devotion will often take the form of careful preparation, exact offerings, correct timing, and fidelity to inherited procedure. A visionary personality may love the deity intensely, yet devotion may express itself primarily through dreams, possession, altered states, signs, and spontaneous revelation. The same faculty changes character according to the mode that governs it. Devotion within a ritual consciousness differs from devotion within a visionary consciousness. Logic serving an integrative architectural aim differs from logic pursued as an autonomous analytical end. Compassion arising from devotion differs from compassion organized around liberation and responsibility for suffering beings. Ascetic discipline serving a subtractive-axial path differs from asceticism treated as the primary means of purification. The dominant mode does not merely stand beside the others, it orchestrates them. This makes some spiritual figures difficult to classify by a single label. Abhinavagupta was a philosopher, exegete, ritualist, Kaula initiate, poet, and mystic. Yet his dominant movement appears integrative and architectural. Distinctions are unfolded, related, and gathered into an immense structure, repeatedly returned to Bhairava as its luminous center. His analytical rigor, ritual knowledge, transgressive initiatory current, devotion, and ecstasy all enter that larger organizing intelligence. Ramana Maharshi presents a different configuration. The subtractive-axial movement was dominant. Questions about philosophy, yoga, cosmology, ritual, karma, devotion, and mystical states were repeatedly returned toward the source of the I. Yet devotion was not absent. His relation to Arunachala could become intensely lyrical and personal, while ascetic simplicity, scriptural intelligence, surrender, humor, and silent presence all entered the same life. Zen offers related but not identical expressions of this mode. Sitting, direct pointing, and koan practice may cut through conceptual proliferation and the assumed solidity of subject and object without affirming Ramana's metaphysical language of the self. Christian apopheticism and Buddhist emptiness teachings offer still other forms of subtraction. The shared movement is a refusal to keep adding spiritual content when the axis of experience itself has not been examined. What is found or not found at that axis remains a matter of real doctrinal difference. Ramakrishna offers another composition in which devotion and visionary ecstasy dominate, while ritual, asceticism, symbolic imagination, and sudden non-dual insight enter the same field. Concentrated types do exist, and concentration can produce extraordinary depth. Decades within one mode may disclose refinements invisible to more widely distributed attention. Yet concentration also increases the danger of enclosure. Other faculties become distractions or lower stages, and fidelity becomes monopoly. Mixed personalities possess more possibilities of correction. Devotion may soften logic, logic may test vision, ethical discipline may expose immaturity beneath mystical language, but also a greater danger of fragmentation. Variety can become spiritual consumption, with each mode abandoned when it becomes demanding. The presence of many modes does not automatically indicate integration. Integration is not the same as accumulation. A personality becomes integrated when the modes cease competing for total sovereignty and begin to perform distinct functions within a wider life. Devotion may open tenderness without dictating metaphysics. Logic may expose contradiction without humiliating emotion. Ritual may provide form without becoming sacred bureaucracy. Subtractive-Axial practice may interrupt compulsive thought without dismissing every psychological distinction. Vision may be received without becoming unquestionable revelation. The Integrative-Architectural faculty may bring experience into relation without constructing another final system. Transgressive practice may recover what has been rejected without treating every boundary as oppression or every impulse as sacred. The mature configuration is not necessarily equal balance. A dominant mode may remain. A person whose natural intelligence is architectural will probably continue to understand through comparison, articulation, and synthesis. A natural devotee may always return most readily to song, remembrance, and relation. A subtractive contemplative may experience silence as more fundamental than explanation. The task is not to erase temperament, it is to prevent temperament from becoming an ontology. What comes naturally to one person is not thereby the universal form of spiritual maturity. Modes may also change their relative position during a lifetime. A person may begin in devotion, later pass through philosophical inquiry, then be drawn toward contemplation or ritual. An early mode may cease to dominate without disappearing entirely. The earlier current may remain as a living layer of the personality. Sacred names may still open the heart. Ascetic training may preserve discipline. Contemplation may still cut through inflation, and a former tradition may continue to supply language and gratitude. Changing predominance does not prove that the earlier mode was false. A spiritual language may carry an entire period of life without remaining the only language in which the person can speak. One can stop granting a mode sovereignty without denying what it once gave. Spiritual biographies are often rewritten too simply. Later conversion is treated as proof that the previous path was error, or earlier commitment is defended as eternally final because change would feel like betrayal. Both overlook the possibility that a mode was genuinely transformative and still ceased to be sovereign. The same applies to spiritual teachers. A teacher may embody one mode with exceptional purity and become indispensable at a particular stage. Yet the student may later need faculties that the teacher did not cultivate or emphasize. This does not invalidate the encounter, it places it. The presence of several modes within one personality also creates a subtler problem. One mode may disguise itself in the language of another. Missionary ambition may present itself as compassion. Emotional dependency may present itself as devotion. Compulsive order may present itself as reverence for ritual. Intellectual pride may present itself as comprehensive integration. Grandiosity may present itself as visionary receptivity. Appetite or impulsiveness may present itself as transgressive freedom. Avoidance may present itself as subtraction, detachment, or freedom from the person. Because the modes overlap, their distortions can borrow one another's vocabulary. A person must therefore ask not only which spiritual language is being used, but which need is actually governing the movement. Is service responding to suffering or satisfying the need to be indispensable? Does ritual deepen attention or provide control? Does analysis clarify the structure or postpone surrender? Does subtraction loosen identification or erase a psychological reality that still needs to be faced? Does transgression transform a boundary or merely give desire a sacred justification? The same act may arise from different modes and produce very different fruit. The purpose of identifying predominance is therefore not to assign a permanent spiritual identity. It is to make the inner organization more visible. A spiritual personality is usually polyphonic, but not without structure. Several voices may be present. One often carries the main movement. Others support it, interrupt it, challenge it, or occasionally take the foreground. Maturity does not require silencing this plurality. It requires hearing which voice is speaking, what it can genuinely contribute, and when it has begun claiming the entire composition as its own. Dignity and characteristic distortion. Every spiritual mode contains a genuine power. It would be dishonest to speak only of its dangers. This point is important because the aim of the series is not to expose all paths as disguises of ego, nor to reduce spiritual life to a collection of psychological compensations. A mode becomes influential because it reveals something real, or at least something experienced as real, with unusual force. Devotion can gather the emotional life around love and remembrance. Ascetic discipline can loosen slavery to appetite. Ritual can preserve embodied sacred form across generations. Compassion can prevent awakening from becoming indifferent to suffering. Analysis can expose contradiction and sentimental exaggeration. The subtractive-axial movement can loosen identification with the claimant of every experience. Architectural intelligence can relate levels that would otherwise remain fragmented. Vision can disclose symbolic or autonomous material that deliberate thought cannot manufacture. Transgressive practice can recover embodiment, power, shame, desire, and other rejected dimensions as possible material for transformation. These are not small contributions, but each power generates a corresponding distortion when it becomes absolute or is appropriated by the personality. Love becomes dependency, discipline self-violence, form rigidity, compassion, a savior identity, analysis, sterile correctness, subtraction, premature erasure, integration, totality, inflation, revelation, grandiosity, and transgression, the sacralization of appetite or exemption from ordinary ethical judgment. The distortion often resembles the mature form closely enough to borrow its authority. A dependent devotee may appear surrendered. A rigid ritualist may appear faithful. An aggressive missionary may appear compassionate, a dry dialectician may appear rigorous, a psychologically avoidant contemplative may appear detached, a grandiose medium may appear receptive, an inflated transgressive practitioner may appear liberated from convention. The outer language can remain correct while the underlying function has changed. The mature and distorted forms therefore cannot be distinguished only by doctrine, technique, or intensity. They must be judged by what the practice actually produces in the person. Does it reduce self-importance or give self-importance a sacred vocabulary? Does it increase responsibility or provide a metaphysical excuse for avoiding it? Does it deepen contact with reality or make the framework more immune to correction? Does it make the person more capable of relationship or more dependent upon submission and rank? Does it create greater freedom or merely a more exalted identity? These questions are uncomfortable because they move attention away from what a practitioner claims to practice and toward what the practice has actually become in the person. Decades of mantra do not prove emotional independence. Elaborate ritual does not prove flexibility. Mastery of a system does not prove insight into personal motive. Fluent non-duality does not prevent wounded authority. Powerful visions do not prevent fragmentation. Longevity, complexity, intensity, and sincerity do not by themselves demonstrate transformation. A person can be completely sincere and still misunderstand what is occurring. The question is not whether the person was pretending, it is whether the mode has produced its mature fruit or only intensified the personality through its own symbolic language. Each mode is well equipped to expose one form of ego. Devotion challenges self-sufficiency. Asceticism challenges obedience to appetite. Analysis challenges confused belief. Subtraction challenges identification with the claimant. Compassion challenges indifference. Ritual challenges dependence upon mood. Architectural integration challenges unconscious contradiction. Vision challenges the monopoly of deliberate consciousness. Transgression challenges the exclusion of embodiment and the rejected parts of life from the sacred. Yet each also offers the ego a corresponding refuge, the most surrendered, the pure one, the guardian of transmission, the one who lives for all beings, the one who understands, the one beyond mind, the chosen vessel, the one who contains all perspectives, or the adept beyond limitation. The ego does not always resist spiritual practice from outside. It may move into the center of the practice and begin speaking its language. This does not mean that every strong spiritual identity is false. Practices require continuity, and continuity naturally shapes character. A person who has devoted decades to prayer, study, ritual, or contemplation will be changed by it and may reasonably describe themselves through that path. The problem begins when function becomes rank. I practice devotion becomes I possess the deepest heart. I understand this doctrine becomes I stand above those who understand only partially. I have undergone this initiation becomes ordinary judgment no longer applies to me. I have experienced a current becomes my words carry a higher authority. The mature form remains connected with its work. The distorted form becomes occupied with the status of the practitioner. This is why the greatest danger may arise not in weak modes, but in powerful ones. A shallow system rarely generates profound transformation, but it also rarely provides a convincing foundation for absolute authority. A mode that has actually revealed something immense can become much harder to question. The original experience may be genuine. Love, silence, numinous encounter, philosophical insight, ritual intensity, or temporary dissolution of ordinary distinctions. Distortion does not require the experience to be false, it requires the personality to draw conclusions from it that the experience itself does not justify. A state of non-ordinary consciousness does not prove stable realization. A powerful ritual does not prove the dissolution of narcissism. A precise argument does not prove existential understanding. An act of service does not prove freedom from the need to be needed. A deep devotional emotion does not prove that the object of devotion is being perceived without projection. A genuine insight does not make its interpretation final. The distinction between event, fruit, and interpretation must therefore remain central. What happened? What did it actually change? What meaning was later assigned to it? These questions are especially necessary because spiritual traditions often provide interpretations in advance. The experience is named before it is fully examined. Tears are named bhava, bodily energy kundalini, silence realization, a dream instruction, transgression freedom, compulsive service compassion, and strict adherence purity. The traditional language may be correct, but it may also conceal the difference between resemblance and attainment. The series will therefore approach the distortions with two forms of restraint. The first is restraint against romanticization. A sacred vocabulary will not be accepted as proof that a mature spiritual process has occurred. The second is restraint against reduction. Distortion will not be used to dismiss the truth or dignity of the mode itself. Dependent devotees do not disprove devotion. Bypassing does not disprove subtractive practice. Rigidity does not disprove ritual. Missionary narcissism does not disprove compassionate commitment. Inflation does not disprove vision. And sacralized appetite does not disprove every transgressive path. A mode must be judged by its highest realizations as well as by its common counterfeits. But the highest realization should not be used to excuse the counterfeit. This balance is difficult. Criticism often begins after disappointment and seeks to reverse the former hierarchy. What was once revered becomes treated as worthless. Conversely, reverence may make every criticism appear hostile or spiritually immature. A more honest approach holds both sides together. This mode has genuine dignity. This mode has produced real transformation. This mode also contains predictable dangers. The greater its power, the more carefully its characteristic distortion must be examined. The aim is not to become suspicious of every spiritual movement. It is to develop discrimination gentle enough to understand what the mode has given, and precise enough to distinguish its real work from the persona it can create. Each later essay will therefore return to three questions. What does this mode see with unusual clarity? What does its mature fruit look like in a human life? What distortion emerges when its particular truth is made absolute or appropriated as identity? The dignity and the danger cannot be separated completely. They grow from the same root. A spiritual mode becomes mature not by losing its distinctive force, but by exercising that force without granting itself immunity from correction. The purpose and limits of this series. This series is not a history of doctrines, a psychological reduction of spiritual experience, or a new hierarchy in which 9 modes are arranged from primitive to advanced. Its central question is narrower. Which faculty of consciousness becomes predominant in a spiritual life? What kind of world does it construct? And what happens when that world becomes sovereign? The modes allow comparison across traditions without pretending that doctrinal differences are irrelevant. They reveal similarities of operation beneath differences of language and differences of operation beneath apparent doctrinal unity. Experience must remain distinct from final interpretation, and the map must remain conscious of its own integrative-architectural orientation. It is meant to sharpen perception, not to replace living encounter. The series also refuses 2 opposite simplifications. The first is the belief that all paths are essentially the same. They are not. They cultivate different faculties, expose different forms of bondage, and carry different risks. Subtractive contemplation is not devotional surrender. Ritual precision is not visionary receptivity. Analytical discrimination is not architectural integration. Transgressive transformation is not reducible to ritual, embodiment, or conceptual synthesis. The second simplification is that one mode must therefore be universally supreme. A method may be exceptionally precise for one task without becoming the complete measure of spiritual life. The subtractive-axial mode may trace identification with unmatched sharpness. Devotion may transform the emotional life with incomparable depth. Analysis may expose contradiction, and architectural intelligence may integrate divided levels. None of these excellences makes its language universally sufficient. The modes are not equal in every function, but functional excellence is not total supremacy. The more useful questions are concrete. What can this mode do? What preparation does it require? What does it transform or leave untouched? What distortion imitates its maturity? And what corrective might another mode provide? Such questions return the inquiry to human consequences. A doctrine may claim the highest metaphysical position, but does its practice produce less self-importance, greater responsibility, honesty about motive, openness to correction, stability in ordinary life, love without dependency, discipline without cruelty, clarity without contempt, and freedom without evasion? These questions are not sufficient to measure realization, but any spirituality that consistently fails them requires scrutiny. The ultimate purpose of the series is therefore not classification for its own sake. It is the recovery of proportion. Proportion does not require ingratitude. A path can remain beloved without being made total. A person may have a dominant spiritual temperament without treating that temperament as the universal architecture of consciousness. A tradition may preserve an immense truth without containing every truth. A teacher may embody one mode with extraordinary purity without becoming the final judge of every other path. A practice may transform an entire life without becoming the last possible form of transformation. The point is not to make a person spiritually homeless by dismantling every world that has sustained them. It is to let that world have windows and doors. The modes can then enter relationship rather than rivalry. Devotion can soften dry analysis. Analysis can question visionary certainty. Ritual can give durable form to what feeling alone cannot preserve. Ethical purification can test whether mystical language has changed conduct. Compassion can challenge indifference. Subtractive practice can interrupt the identities created by every path. Architectural intelligence can distinguish their functions and bring them into proportion. Vision can open what deliberate consciousness could not construct. Transgressive practice can ask whether spiritual recognition has truly included embodiment, power, shame, desire, and the rejected dimensions of life. None of these faculties needs to disappear, and none needs to rule permanently. The essays that follow will approach each mode on its own terms, through its central intuition, its way of knowing, its mature possibilities, its characteristic exemplars, and the distortion most likely to arise when its truth becomes absolute. The purpose is neither reverence without criticism, nor criticism without reverence. It is to understand how a mode can become a path, how a path can become a world, and how a world can remain transparent rather than turning into a prison. A spiritual mode reaches maturity when it can disclose its truth without requiring every other truth to speak in its language.